Snow-capped peaks loomed over Miller's Gap, where 12-year-old Ethan Parker lived alone with his grandfather since the accident that claimed his parents last winter. His loyal German shepherd, Max, is always at his side. Gathering firewood one bitter afternoon, both boy and dog froze at a weak whimper carried on the wind. Following it, they discovered a golden retriever, its paw bloodied and eyes pleading. Despite his grandfather's warnings about straying too far, Ethan couldn't abandon the injured creature. As darkness threatened, the wounded dog lurched to its feet and limped determinedly uphill, constantly looking back as if beckoning. Max growled warily as they reached a small cabin, weathered and forgotten, with one faint, flickering light inside. Who lived in this hidden place? What secret lay behind that weathered door? And why had this wounded animal led him here, to a truth that would shatter everything he thought he knew? The winter wind howled through the pines as Ethan adjusted his woolen cap, his breath forming clouds in the frigid mountain air while he and Max gathered fallen branches for the fireplace. Grandfather had warned him not to venture beyond the ridge, especially with snow threatening to blanket Miller's Gap by nightfall, but the woodpile back home wouldn't last through tomorrow at the rate they were burning it. Max suddenly perked his ears and darted between two massive boulders, barking insistently at something hidden from view. "Max, come back," Ethan called, his voice nearly swallowed by the whistling wind, but the German shepherd only barked more urgently, compelling Ethan to follow despite his grandfather's warnings echoing in his mind. Pushing through snow-laden branches, he discovered Max standing protectively over a golden retriever lying on its side in the snow, its honey-colored fur matted with blood around one paw. Eyes glazed with pain but watching them intently. "Hey there," Ethan whispered, kneeling slowly and extending his hand while Max whined sympathetically beside him. The injured dog flinched but didn't growl, instead raising its head slightly to meet Ethan's gaze with an intelligence that made the boy shiver from something other than cold. As Ethan gingerly examined the wounded paw, finding a deep gash that needed attention, the golden retriever suddenly struggled to its feet, limping a few steps uphill before turning to look back at them expectantly. "You want us to follow you?" Ethan murmured, glancing at the darkening sky and knowing grandfather would be furious if he didn't return soon, yet something in the dog's pleading eyes made it impossible to turn away. Max seemed equally determined, nudging Ethan's hand with his nose and then trotting after the limping retriever, "Just to get you somewhere safe," Ethan decided, abandoning his gathered wood and following the animals deeper into the forest, up a winding game trail he'd never noticed before, the snow beginning to fall in lazy, fat flakes around them. The mountain air grew sharper as they climbed, with Ethan occasionally losing sight of the golden retriever, only to find it waiting patiently around the next bend, always watching to ensure he followed. The trek continued for nearly an hour, with Ethan's concern growing as sunlight faded behind the western peaks, knowing he'd be unable to find his way home in darkness. Just as he was about to give up and attempt to retrace his steps, the trees opened into a small clearing where a cabin stood, weathered and listing slightly with age but undeniably occupied, evidenced by the thin wisp of smoke from its stone chimney and a single flickering light visible through a frost-edged window. The golden retriever limped purposefully toward the cabin door, leaving crimson droplets in the pristine snow, while Max remained close to Ethan, suddenly tense and uncertain. Ethan hesitated at the edge of the clearing, torn between his responsibility to return home before grandfather truly worried and his inability to abandon the injured animal that had so deliberately led him here. The cabin door remained closed, no sign of movement within beyond that wavering light, and as the snow began to fall more heavily, obscuring the path behind them, Ethan realized he faced a choice that somehow felt more significant than merely deciding whether to approach a stranger's door or turn back into the gathering storm. The golden retriever looked back once more, its eyes seeming to hold a message Ethan couldn't quite decipher, before scratching weakly at the cabin's door with its uninjured paw, leaving Ethan to wonder who might dwell so far from town in this remote corner of the mountains, and what secret lay waiting to be discovered inside. Gathering his courage, Ethan approached the cabin door, Max close behind with hackles slightly raised, and knocked 3 times, the sound swallowed by the thickening snowfall that had already begun to cover their tracks. Long seconds passed before he heard shuffling footsteps, followed by the metallic scrape of a lock being turned, and the door creaked open to reveal an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun, her face a map of deep lines and weathered wisdom, sharp blue eyes regarding him with immediate suspicion. "What business brings a child to my door in this weather?" she demanded rather than asked, one gnarled hand gripping a walking stick, until her gaze dropped to the golden retriever who pushed weakly past Ethan's legs and whimpered at her feet. "Scout," she gasped, her stern expression instantly melting into concern as she knelt with surprising agility to examine her pet. "He's hurt his paw pretty bad," Ethan explained, stamping snow from his boots but remaining on the threshold, uncertain of his welcome despite the wounded dog's clear familiarity with this woman. "Found him down by the ridge, and he led us here." The woman glanced up sharply at this, studying Ethan's face with an intensity that made him step back, then her eyes flickered to Max, who maintained a protective stance beside the boy. "Well, don't just stand there letting all my heat escape," she finally said, voice softening slightly as she gestured them inside. "I'm Eleanor Winters, and it seems Scout here has decided to trust you, which counts for something in these mountains." The cabin's interior was smaller than it appeared from outside, but surprisingly cozy, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall, its dancing flames casting warm light across simple, well-worn furniture, walls lined with books, dried herbs hanging from rafters, and an old wood stove radiating blessed heat. Eleanor directed Ethan to sit at a rough-hewn table while she gathered supplies from a cabinet, speaking softly to Scout, who had collapsed on a braided rug before the fire, Max cautiously settling beside him after a reassuring nod from Ethan, as the woman tended to Scout's injured paw with practiced hands, cleaning, applying a strong-smelling salve, and wrapping it with a strip of clean cloth. Ethan's attention wandered to the mantelpiece where several framed photographs stood partially obscured by shadow. One in particular caught his eye, a young woman with long chestnut hair standing beside a mountain lake, her smile achingly familiar, though Ethan couldn't immediately place why. He rose without thinking and moved closer, heart suddenly pounding as recognition dawned, for the woman in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to his mother, the same gentle eyes and determined chin he'd memorized from the few pictures his grandfather kept. "Who is this?" he asked, voice cracking slightly as he pointed to the photograph, turning to find Eleanor watching him with an unreadable expression, her hands gone still on Scout's bandage. "You shouldn't be nosing through other people's belongings, boy," she replied, but her voice lacked conviction, and something flickered in her eyes, a mixture of pain and surprise that confirmed Ethan's suspicion that something significant connected this isolated cabin to his own history. Eleanor abruptly returned to tending Scout, avoiding Ethan's questioning gaze while asking his name and where he lived in a tone that suggested casual interest, but couldn't quite disguise her tension. "Ethan Parker," he answered, watching her face carefully. "I live with my grandfather, Frank Parker, in the cabin down past Miller's Ridge." At the mention of his grandfather, Eleanor's shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly, and she busied herself putting away her medical supplies, her silence more telling than any words could have been, leaving Ethan certain that this strange encounter was far more than a coincidence, and that the mystery of why Scout had led him here had only begun to unfold. The wind had transformed from occasional gusts to a continuous howl during the hour Eleanor spent tending to Scout, and when Ethan finally approached the small window beside the door, his stomach dropped at the sight of swirling white completely obscuring the trees that had been visible earlier. "I need to get home," he said, turning back to Eleanor, who stood watching him with an unreadable expression, one hand absently stroking Scout's head as the dog dozed by the fire, Max curled protectively nearby. "Not in this you won't," Eleanor replied, her tone leaving no room for argument as she moved to the window and pulled back a faded curtain. "That's a proper mountain blizzard, child. The kind that swallows unwary travelers whole and doesn't spit out their bones till spring thaw." Though her words were harsh, something in her voice suggested genuine concern as she added more wood to the already blazing fire. "Your grandfather will have to manage his worry for one night, because I won't have a child's death on my conscience." Ethan thought of grandfather pacing their cabin floor, perhaps already venturing out to search despite his bad knee. But the ferocity of the storm outside left him little choice but to nod his acceptance of Eleanor's grudging hospitality. "You can take the back room," she said after a lengthy silence, pointing to a narrow doorway beyond the kitchen area. "There are extra blankets in the cedar chest under the window, if you need them." Thanking her awkwardly, Ethan made his way to the small bedroom, Max following close at his heels, leaving Scout contentedly sprawled before the main room's fire. The bedroom was sparsely furnished with a narrow iron-framed bed, a small bedside table, and a worn rug covering rough plank flooring, but it was clean and, most importantly, warm from the heat of the main fireplace that shared a wall with this room. Following Eleanor's directions, Ethan knelt beside a large cedar chest beneath the room's only window, unlatching its heavy lid to search for additional blankets against the deepening chill. The scent of cedar and mothballs wafted up as he lifted the lid, but it was the ornate carving on the inside that made his breath catch. Parker, surrounded by intricate mountain scenes. The craftsmanship undeniably similar to the headboard of his own bed, which grandfather had carved years before Ethan was born. His fingers traced the familiar surname, mind racing with questions that seemed to multiply by the minute, when a sharp voice from the doorway startled him. "I said blankets, not an invitation to pry." Eleanor snapped, moving with surprising speed to close the chest lid firmly. Ethan pulled his hand back, meeting Eleanor's gaze with newfound determination. "That's my family name," he said, the statement hanging in the room's dim light. "Why is it carved into your cedar chest?" Eleanor's expression hardened, shadows deepening the lines around her mouth and eyes. "These mountains are full of Parkers," she replied dismissively. "Always have been. Like weeds sprouting after spring rain." But her avoidance only intensified Ethan's certainty that Eleanor knew far more than she was willing to share, and that the chest, like the photograph on her mantel, represented another piece of a puzzle he hadn't known existed until today. As Eleanor turned to leave, Ethan noticed her hands trembling slightly before she clasped them together. "Get some sleep," she ordered, her voice softer than before. "The storm may break by morning, and you need to return to your grandfather." But as she closed the door behind her, leaving Ethan alone with Max in the small bedroom, he knew sleep would be elusive tonight, his mind too full of questions about the mysterious connection between this isolated woman and his own fractured family history. Frank Parker stood at his cabin window, watching the snow pile against the glass in ever-growing drifts, his weathered face taut with fear as the hands of the old mantel clock crept past 7, then 8. With no sign of Ethan or Max returning from their firewood gathering, the storm had arrived earlier and more violently than anyone in Miller's Gap had anticipated, transforming the familiar mountainside into a howling white nightmare that swallowed landmarks and obliterated trails. Frank had already called the Thompsons and the Wilsons on his ancient radio set, and both families had arrived bundled in their heaviest winter gear, stomping snow from their boots in Frank's tiny entryway, while discussing search patterns and emergency supplies. "He knows these woods," Frank insisted, as much to himself as to his neighbors, his voice betraying the tremor he fought to control. "That boy's got mountain sense, and Max wouldn't let him wander too far." But his gnarled hands belied his confident words as they checked and rechecked the batteries and flashlights, his movements becoming more frantic with each passing minute. Joe Thompson, a burly logger with 3 decades of mountain rescue experience, laid a steadying hand on Frank's shoulder. "We'll find him, Frank, but we need to be methodical, especially in this whiteout." Sheriff Benson arrived next, accompanied by 2 deputies and the distinct crackle of police radios reporting near-zero visibility on the mountain roads. The kitchen quickly became a makeshift command center, maps spread across the worn table as Frank traced Ethan's likely path with a trembling finger. "He usually keeps to this ridge when gathering wood," Frank explained, but his eyes darted nervously to the northern section of the map, a region he'd explicitly forbidden Ethan from exploring, though he'd never explained why. The search party divided into teams, radio checks completed with grim efficiency, when Bill Wilson, adjusting his scarf near the door, mentioned casually, if he got caught in the worst of it, he might have holed up somewhere, maybe even found that old cabin up north of Whispering Pines. Frank's reaction was immediate and visceral, his face draining of color as the thermos he'd been filling crashed to the floor, splashing hot coffee across the planked wood. "What cabin?" he demanded, his voice suddenly sharp enough to silence the room, eyes wide with an emotion that seemed to transcend ordinary worry. Bill stepped back, startled by the intensity of Frank's response. "That hunting cabin past the 3rd Ridge, the one folks say some recluse lives in, hardly ever comes to town." Sheriff Benson studied Frank's face with newfound interest. "You know something about that place we should be aware of, Frank?" he asked quietly, and the room's atmosphere shifted as everyone sensed the undercurrent of something more significant than a boy lost in a storm. Frank's shoulders sagged as he bent to mop up the spilled coffee with jerky, distracted movements, avoiding the questioning gazes of his neighbors. "It's nothing," he muttered unconvincingly. Just an old tale about that area being dangerous, unstable ground during heavy snow. But his hands shook more violently now, and when he straightened, the haunted look in his eyes told a different story entirely. If he's gone that way, Frank continued after a lengthy pause, I need to be on that search team. His tone left no room for argument, and as the men filed out into the howling storm, flashlight beams cutting weak paths through the curtain of white, Sheriff Benson held Frank back momentarily, studying the older man's face. Whatever's eating at you about that cabin might help us find your boy, he said simply. But Frank merely adjusted his hat and pushed past into the blizzard, his expression a complex mixture of determination and what appeared disturbingly like guilt. Dawn arrived with startling brightness, sunlight glinting off the pristine blanket of snow that transformed the mountain landscape into a dazzling white expanse. The storm having exhausted itself sometime in the early morning hours, Ethan woke to the enticing aroma of coffee and something sweet baking, finding Eleanor already dressed and moving about her small kitchen with surprising energy for someone her age. Scout resting comfortably by the rekindled fire, his bandaged paw extended carefully before him. Your dog seems better, Ethan observed as he accepted a steaming mug of what turned out to be hot chocolate rather than coffee, Max stretching lazily at his feet before padding over to check on his new canine friend. Eleanor merely nodded, her manner less sharp than the previous evening but still guarded, as though she'd spent the night calculating exactly how much to reveal to her unexpected guest. After a breakfast of surprisingly delicious blueberry scones, Eleanor disappeared into the back room, returning with a leather-bound book that she placed on the table with evident reluctance. Your mother loved these mountains, she said without preamble, pushing the journal toward Ethan, whose heart began racing at the casual confirmation of what he'd suspected. She kept this during her summers here. With trembling fingers, Ethan opened the weathered cover to find pages filled with elegant handwriting he recognized immediately as his mother's, interspersed with pressed wildflowers, their colors faded but still visible. Mountain columbine, Indian paintbrush, lupine, and dozens more he couldn't name. Beside each preserved blossom were notes in his mother's hand about where they were found, the date collected, and occasionally cryptic personal observations. Found near the speaking stones. Grandmother says they heal broken hearts, and by the hidden spring, when the moon was full, its water tastes like memories. Ethan looked up to find Eleanor watching him intently, something like longing softening her stern features. You knew my mother well, he ventured, not quite a question, and Eleanor sighed, turning to gaze out the frost-rimmed window. Catherine spent every summer here until she was 18, she replied, her voice taking on a distant quality. She knew these mountains better than anyone, could name every plant, every bird call. But when Ethan asked directly about his mother's connection to Eleanor, the old woman's expression shuttered closed, and she busied herself collecting the breakfast dishes. You should start back before the sun gets too high and begins melting the top snow, she said, clearly ending the conversation as she carefully reclaimed the journal, though not before Ethan glimpsed a photograph tucked between its pages, partially visible, showing a younger Eleanor with her arm around his mother as a teenager. The journey home proved easier than expected, with the storm having carved a clear path through the forest, the weight of the fresh snow bending branches to create natural archways that Ethan and Max passed beneath in thoughtful silence. Approximately halfway back, in an area Ethan had never explored before yesterday, he noticed something unnatural among the pristine white, orange survey stakes protruding from the snow at regular intervals, forming a grid pattern across a section of land that included an unusually flat plateau with a spectacular view of the valley below. Nearby, a metal sign half buried by the snowfall caught his attention, and brushing away the white powder revealed the words, Mountain Vista Development, future home of Eagle's Nest Resort and Spa, alongside a sleek logo and contact information for interested investors. The Parker cabin came into view just as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the western peaks, smoke curling from the chimney a welcome sight after Ethan's long trek home. But his relief evaporated instantly upon entering to find not only his grandfather but Sheriff Benson and half a dozen neighbors crowded into their small living room, all faces turning toward him with expressions ranging from relief to astonishment. Thank God, Grandfather exclaimed, crossing the room in 3 long strides despite his bad knee, enveloping Ethan in a fierce embrace before holding him at arm's length, eyes scanning for injuries. Where in heaven's name have you been, boy? He demanded, voice breaking between anger and fading panic. Before Ethan could formulate a response, Max bounded forward to greet Frank, followed by surprised murmurs as the neighbors began pulling on coats and gloves. Sheriff Benson speaking into his radio to call off the remaining search parties. Once they were alone, Frank's relief curdled quickly into something harder, as Ethan recounted finding Scout and following him to Eleanor's cabin. His grandfather's expression darkening with each word until he slammed his palm against the kitchen table. "You will never go back to that cabin or speak to that woman again," he thundered, color rising in his weathered cheeks. "She's dangerous, Ethan," filled with confused notions and bitter lies. Ethan stood his ground, emboldened by the discoveries of the past 24 hours. "She knew Mom," he said quietly. "She showed me Mom's journal with the pressed flowers, and there are photographs of them together." Frank's reaction was immediate and alarming, his face draining of color as he sank heavily into a chair. "What else did she tell you?" he asked, voice suddenly quiet but intense. "What lies did she fill your head with?" Frustration bubbled up in Ethan's chest, years of unanswered questions about his mother crystallizing in this moment. "Why won't anyone tell me the truth about my own family?" he demanded. "Mom's journal called Eleanor grandmother, and the Parker name is carved into a chest in her cabin." Frank's eyes widened at this revelation before narrowing dangerously, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Eleanor Winters lost her grip on reality years ago, Ethan, after her husband died. She blamed everyone around her, including your mother, and became so unstable Catherine had to cut ties with her for her own safety." But something in his grandfather's averted gaze and twitching hands suggested deception, and for the first time in his life, Ethan found himself doubting Frank's words. "I also saw survey stakes on the way home," Ethan added, watching his grandfather carefully, "for some resort development. They're all over the land between here and Eleanor's cabin." Frank's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, a tightening around his eyes and a momentary stillness before he waved dismissively. "Rich folks from the city always have some scheme for these mountains," he muttered, rising to stoke the fire with unnecessary force. "Never amounts to much." As evening settled around their cabin, the familiar creaks and sighs of the old structure seemed suddenly ominous to Ethan, as though the walls themselves held secrets they were struggling to contain. And watching his grandfather methodically clean his rifle later that night with unusual attention to detail, Ethan couldn't shake the certainty that there was far more to the story of their family and Eleanor Winters than anyone was willing to tell him, a truth that somehow connected to that development company and whatever lay buried in their mountains past. 3 days after Ethan's adventure in the storm, a gleaming black SUV with tinted windows wound its way up their rutted driveway, looking as out of place against their weathered cabin as a hawk among sparrows. Its pristine exterior unmarked by the mud and dust that coated every other vehicle in Miller's Gap. Frank stood watching from the porch, shoulders squared and jaw set in what Ethan recognized as his grandfather's defensive posture, while Ethan observed from the partially open window of his small bedroom, curiosity overwhelming his promise to finish his chores before noon. The driver's door swung open to reveal a tall man in an expensive-looking overcoat, his silver hair perfectly styled, gold watch glinting in the sunlight as he surveyed the modest property with barely concealed disdain before approaching with an artificial smile. "Frank Parker," the stranger called, extending a manicured hand that Frank regarded suspiciously before accepting with obvious reluctance. "Richard Blackwell, Mountain Vista Development. We spoke on the phone last month." Their conversation began with artificial pleasantries about the weather and the mountain views, but quickly shifted as Blackwell produced a leather portfolio containing documents and glossy renderings of what appeared to be a massive resort complex. "Frank, you're sitting on a gold mine here," Blackwell insisted, his voice carrying clearly through the crisp mountain air to where Ethan eavesdropped. "Our offer is more than generous, twice the market value for this property, and we're prepared to include a lifetime membership to the resort facilities for you and your grandson." Frank's response was too low for Ethan to hear, but Blackwell's charming facade slipped momentarily, revealing something harder beneath. "The development is moving forward with or without your cooperation, Frank," he said, voice now crisp and businesslike. "The county commissioners have already approved the preliminary plans, and we've secured every surrounding property except yours and that old woman's claim up north." Ethan's heart raced at the reference to Eleanor, and he leaned closer to the window, straining to catch every word, as Blackwell continued with growing impatience. "We both know her claim to that land is tenuous at best, and my legal team is already preparing to challenge it." Your continued resistance only delays the inevitable, while depriving your grandson of financial security that could transform his future. Frank's voice finally rose enough for Ethan to hear clearly, rough with emotion. This land has been in the Parker family for 4 generations. Blackwell, not just as property but as a trust, a responsibility. Some things matter more than money. The developer's laugh held no warmth. Noble sentiments, Frank, truly moving, but ultimately impractical. The world changes whether we wish it to or not, and fighting progress only ensures you get crushed beneath its wheels. As their conversation grew more heated, Ethan slipped outside and circled behind the woodshed to approach within better hearing distance, Max following silently at his heels. He arrived just in time to hear Blackwell's parting remarks, delivered with chilling precision. You have 1 week to reconsider our offer before it becomes substantially less generous. And Frank, if you're maintaining this stubborn position out of some misguided loyalty to Eleanor Winters, let me assure you she's already signed preliminary papers allowing us water rights access across her property, despite whatever she might have told you to the contrary. The lie was so smooth, so confidently delivered that even Ethan might have believed it, had he not seen Eleanor's obvious isolation and distrust of outsiders firsthand. But watching his grandfather's face pale at the information, Ethan realized with growing unease that whatever connected these 3 adults, his grandfather, Eleanor, and now this slick developer, went far deeper than mere property disputes or family estrangement. The Friday morning sky dawned clear and cold, perfect for what Ethan had carefully planned since overhearing the conversation between his grandfather and Blackwell 3 days earlier. Frank had left before sunrise for a mandatory town meeting regarding winter road maintenance, providing the opportunity Ethan had been waiting for. And within 30 minutes of his grandfather's departure, Ethan had packed a small knapsack with sandwiches, a flashlight, and his mother's old compass, whistling softly for Max, who bounded eagerly to his side, sensing adventure. The journey to Eleanor's cabin proved easier in daylight, with clear skies, though Ethan was careful to avoid the marked development area, instead following a longer route that Scout had originally led them along. By mid-morning, they crested the final ridge, Eleanor's cabin coming into view with smoke curling invitingly from its chimney. And Ethan's sudden nervousness nearly made him turn back, until he spotted Scout sunning himself on the small porch, the golden retriever's head lifting at their approach, tail thumping a welcoming rhythm against the weathered boards. The cabin door opened before they reached it, Eleanor appearing with an expression that shifted rapidly from surprise to resignation, then to something softer as Scout rose to greet Max with obvious delight, his injured paw still bandaged but bearing weight now as the 2 dogs circled each other playfully. Your grandfather knows you're here, I suppose? Eleanor asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer, stepping aside to allow Ethan entry without waiting for his response. The cabin seemed different in full daylight, less mysterious but somehow more revealing, with sunlight streaming through windows to illuminate details Ethan had missed during the storm. Intricate quilts displaying mountain scenes, shelves of leather-bound books, bundles of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and most interestingly, additional photographs he hadn't noticed before, partially hidden among various knickknacks. Eleanor busied herself preparing tea, moving with efficient grace around her small kitchen while recounting stories of the mountains in earlier decades, tales of harsh winters that had tested even the most prepared families, of spring floods that had reshaped valleys overnight, and of summer berry harvests so abundant that bears would grow fat and lazy in the high meadows. Though her stories were vivid and clearly personal, Ethan noticed how carefully she avoided any direct mention of his family or her connection to his mother, despite several openings where such references would have been natural. While Eleanor carried their tea to the small table by the window, Ethan's attention was caught by a partially open drawer in a side table, the corner of a photograph album visible within, and as Eleanor turned to retrieve honey from a cupboard, he quickly slid the album free and onto his lap, opening it beneath the table. The first page contained exactly what he'd hoped to find, a color photograph showing a much younger Eleanor with her arm around a small girl of perhaps 6 or 7, their matching chestnut hair and green eyes leaving no doubt this was his mother as a child, their identical smiles revealing the dimple Ethan himself had inherited. Standing before this very cabin with mountains blazing with autumn colors behind them, the inscription below reading, Catherine's first successful hike to Whispering Pines, September 1984, in careful handwriting. Ethan quickly committed every detail to memory before returning the album to its drawer, his mind racing with questions even as Eleanor returned to the table, the knowing look in her eyes suggesting she was fully aware of his discovery but had deliberately allowed it, this silent acknowledgement of their connection forming a tentative bridge across whatever chasm had separated his family for so long. The afternoon light had begun to soften, casting long shadows across Eleanor's cabin floor, when she finally broke their companionable silence with a heavy sigh. Rising from her chair to retrieve something from an old roll-top desk in the corner, her movements deliberate as though each step required conscious decision. "You deserve to know something of your heritage," she said, returning with a worn leather journal, different from the one she had shown him during his first visit, this one smaller and bound with a faded blue ribbon, its pages visibly yellowed with age. Catherine began keeping this when she was 7, her first summer here without her parents hovering over her shoulder. Eleanor placed it gently before Ethan, who accepted it with reverent hands, aware of Max and Scout dozing peacefully together by the hearth as he carefully untied the ribbon and opened to the first page, finding childish handwriting that evolved and matured as he turned through the entries, chronicling years of summer adventures on these very mountainsides. Pressed flowers, crude sketches of wildlife, and carefully recorded observations of stars, weather patterns, and seasonal changes filled the pages, alongside more personal entries that revealed his mother's growing love for these mountains and the freedom she found here, away from what she called the suffocating expectations of town life. Many entries mentioned grandmother, with obvious affection, describing lessons in plant identification, wilderness survival skills, and old stories of the mountain's history, confirming what Ethan had already begun to suspect, that Eleanor was indeed his maternal grandmother. A revelation that only multiplied his questions about why this connection had been severed so completely that he'd never even known of her existence. When he finally looked up, questions tumbling from his lips about why this family bond had been kept secret, why his mother had never brought him here, why grandfather acted as though Eleanor were a dangerous stranger rather than family. The old woman's face tightened with an emotion Ethan couldn't quite identify, her weathered hands reclaiming the journal with gentle firmness. "Some rifts run too deep for simple explanations," she said after a long pause, her gaze fixed on the mountain view beyond her window rather than meeting Ethan's earnest eyes. "And some secrets aren't mine alone to tell." Her expression darkened as she continued, voice dropping almost to a whisper. "These mountains have always attracted powerful men who see only resources to exploit, beauty to commercialize, profits to extract. They wear different faces through the generations, but their hunger remains the same, consuming whatever stands in their way, including families who refuse to bend to their will." The sudden sound of an engine outside interrupted her cryptic warning, both of them turning toward the window as a mud-splattered pickup truck with tinted windows and no visible license plate crawled past the cabin at an unnaturally slow pace. The driver's face obscured, but clearly studying the property with intent focus before accelerating away down the rough mountain track. Eleanor's reaction was immediate and alarming, her already pale complexion whitening further as she moved with surprising speed to bolt the door and close the curtains against the fading afternoon light. "You need to leave now, through the back trail," she insisted, gathering Ethan's knapsack and whistling sharply for Max, who immediately rose to attention. "They're watching again, which means decisions are being made, papers are being signed, and these mountains are running out of time." The urgency in her voice prevented further questions as she pressed a small object into Ethan's palm, closing his fingers around what felt like a key. "Your mother left this for you," Eleanor whispered, "though she never imagined you'd need it so soon." The knocking came 3 sharp raps against Eleanor's door the very next morning, startling Ethan from his dreams of flowing water and whispering trees, the boy having returned to the cabin at first light with determination to learn more about the key Eleanor had given him. Eleanor's eyes had widened with alarm at his unexpected arrival, quickly ushering him toward the back bedroom with urgent whispers about dangerous timing just as the knocking began. "Stay silent, no matter what you hear," she hissed, closing the bedroom door firmly behind him, leaving only a narrow crack through which Ethan could observe the main room where Eleanor smoothed her clothing, set her shoulders, and moved to answer the door with deliberate slowness. The visitor's voice reached him before the man himself came into view, smooth and cultured yet carrying an undercurrent of steel that Ethan recognized instantly. "Miss Winters, lovely to see you again." Richard Blackwell announced as he stepped uninvited into the cabin, his expensive hiking boots incongruous against the worn floorboards, Scout growling softly from his place by the fire, until Eleanor quieted him with a gentle hand motion. "I was hoping we might continue our conversation about the property boundaries without the unnecessary involvement of attorneys," Blackwell continued, removing leather gloves to reveal the same gold watch Ethan had noticed at his grandfather's cabin. From his hiding place, Ethan watched Eleanor's posture stiffen as she gestured Blackwell to a chair while remaining standing herself. "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Blackwell," she replied, her voice steadier than her slightly trembling hands. "My family's claim to this land dates back to 1891 and includes all the adjacent acreage to the western ridge." Blackwell's congenial expression hardened momentarily before he produced documents from his sleek briefcase. "Our surveyors and legal team disagree, Miss Winters. According to county records, your official boundaries end approximately 12 acres south of what you've claimed, which means your access road and water source actually fall within our development rights." The threat hung in the air between them, Eleanor's silence more powerful than any immediate retort as she stared unflinchingly at the developer, who continued with practiced ease. "Mountain Vista is prepared to be generous, despite your continued resistance. We'll allow you lifetime residence in this cabin, provided you sign these easement documents granting us access to develop the surrounding acreage." Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "Your generosity allows me to keep what's already rightfully mine while you destroy everything that gives it meaning." Blackwell's patience visibly thinned as he stood, towering over Eleanor's small frame. "I'll be direct, Miss Winters. Either sign these documents voluntarily, or face an extended legal battle that someone of your limited resources cannot hope to win. Our contractors begin preliminary groundwork next week, regardless of your decision." After Blackwell finally departed with a thinly veiled warning about reconsidering while the offer remains open, Eleanor collapsed into her chair, eyes closed and breathing labored until Ethan emerged cautiously from his hiding place. "He's the man who came to grandfather's cabin," Ethan said unnecessarily, watching emotion play across Eleanor's weathered features before she beckoned him to follow her outside and around the cabin to a small clearing behind it, where she knelt with difficulty beside what appeared to be an ordinary stone circle. "This is what they truly want," she explained, carefully removing several stones to reveal a perfectly circular pool of water so clear it appeared almost luminous in the morning light, its surface mysteriously unmoving despite the mountain breeze. "This spring has sustained these mountains since before human memory, feeding every stream and nurturing every living thing from the ridgetop to the valley floor. The indigenous people who lived here before my ancestors arrived considered it sacred, the mountain's lifeblood, and entrusted its protection to those who came after them." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper as she continued. "The resort they plan would require massive excavation, destroying the underground waterways that connect to this spring, and once that connection is severed, these mountains will slowly die, becoming nothing but pretty scenery for wealthy vacationers who'll never understand what was lost." Eleanor led Ethan along a narrow path winding behind the cabin, deeper into a grove of ancient pines whose massive trunks had clearly stood sentinel for centuries, their branches forming a protective canopy over the path that seemed to have been worn into the earth by countless footsteps over generations. "What I showed you yesterday was merely the surface," Eleanor explained, her voice taking on a reverent quality as they approached what appeared to be an ordinary rock formation embedded in the hillside, partially obscured by thick mountain laurel. With surprising strength, Eleanor pushed aside a flat stone that had been cunningly fitted to appear natural, but moved on hidden hinges to reveal a narrow opening into the mountainside itself. "Watch your step," she cautioned, producing an old lantern she lit with practiced hands, the warm glow illuminating rough-hewn stone steps descending into darkness. Ethan followed cautiously, Max pressing close against his leg as they descended perhaps 20 feet before the passage opened suddenly into a cathedral-like cavern that drew an involuntary gasp from Ethan's lungs. For stretching before them was an underground lake of impossible clarity, its still surface reflecting the stalactites hanging from the cavern ceiling like nature's own chandeliers, while small blue crystals embedded in the surrounding rock walls caught the lantern light and scattered it in mesmerizing patterns across the water. "The Shoshone called this place the Mother's Heart," Eleanor said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "They believed it was the living center of the mountain, the source from which all life flowed. She carefully set the lantern on a flat stone beside the water and knelt with difficulty, dipping her fingers into the crystal pool. The water flows from here through an intricate network of underground streams, feeding every creek, every meadow, every ecosystem on these mountainsides. The mountain laurel that grows nowhere else in the state thrives because of these waters, along with 17 species of wildflowers found only in this valley. Ethan knelt beside her, tentatively touching the water to find it surprisingly warm against his skin, almost silky in texture, unlike any water he'd encountered before. Modern science would tell you it's rich in rare minerals filtered through ancient limestone. Eleanor continued, but the indigenous people who protected this place for thousands of years before my ancestors arrived understood its true value goes beyond chemical composition. They entrusted its guardianship to those who came after, extracting promises that it would remain undisturbed and free-flowing for all creatures who depend upon it. The realization struck Ethan with sudden clarity as he looked around the magnificent underground chamber, connecting Blackwell's veiled threats with the resort plans he'd glimpsed. "The developers know about this," he whispered, understanding blooming across his features. "They don't just want the land for views or ski slopes." Eleanor nodded gravely, her weathered face solemn in the lantern light. "Blackwell discovered references to these waters in old geological surveys, though he doesn't know the exact location. They plan to bottle it, market it as some exclusive ancient mountain miracle water for their wealthy clients, extract it until nothing remains but dry channels and dead forests above." She gestured toward the far wall where Ethan now noticed ancient pictographs etched into the stone, faded with age but still discernible, depicting flowing water, animals, and human figures in various scenes. "7 generations of my family have protected this place," Eleanor said, her voice breaking slightly. "Your mother would have been next in that line had circumstances not torn our family apart. The responsibility should have passed to you in time, with proper preparation, proper understanding of what's truly at stake if these waters fall into the wrong hands." The evening shadows had lengthened across the Parker cabin when Ethan finally returned home, his mind still filled with visions of the underground spring and Eleanor's revelations. To find his grandfather sitting motionless in his old armchair, a half-empty whiskey glass in his gnarled hand, and worry etched deeply across his weathered features. The moment Frank spotted Ethan in the doorway, relief flooded his expression, quickly followed by anger, then resignation, as though he somehow knew exactly where his grandson had been. "You went back to her cabin," Frank stated flatly, not a question but an acknowledgement of inevitable truth. Ethan nodded, removing his jacket and sitting across from his grandfather, gathering courage for the confrontation he could no longer avoid. "She showed me the underground spring," he began, watching his grandfather's face closely. "And I know she's Mom's mother, which makes her my grandmother. What I don't understand is why you've kept this from me all these years, why you've let me believe I had no family beyond you." Frank's hand tightened around his glass, knuckles whitening before he set it down with deliberate control and stared into the dying fire. "I worked for Blackwell Development 30 years ago," he finally admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "Not Richard, but his father, Harrison Blackwell, when the company first set its sights on these mountains. I was young, newly married to your mother's father, desperate for steady work to support my family." Frank rose unsteadily and moved to the window, gazing out at the darkness as words seemed to pour from him after decades of silence. "They hired me as a local consultant for their preliminary surveys, knowing my knowledge of these mountains would be valuable. When our team discovered the underground water system and its ecological significance, Harrison ordered us to bury those findings, alter the reports, claim the water sources were minimal and insignificant." Frank's shoulders slumped as he continued, each word seemingly dragged from some painful depth. "I knew it was wrong, but I convinced myself it was just a job, that someone else would sound the alarm if it truly mattered. Then your grandmother, Eleanor, discovered what I'd done, the reports I'd falsified that directly threatened the spring her family had protected for generations. She confronted me, but instead of admitting my mistake, I doubled down, accused her of exaggerating the spring's importance." Frank turned back to face Ethan, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Your mother was caught between us, torn between loyalty to her husband and her mother's lifelong teachings about our responsibility to these mountains. When she chose to stand with me, Eleanor saw it as the ultimate betrayal of her heritage, of 7 generations of stewardship. The rift grew until we stopped visiting altogether, and your mother tried to build a life away from these mountains, away from the constant reminder of what had been broken. Frank sank back into his chair, suddenly looking older than Ethan had ever seen him. After your parents died in the accident, my guilt became unbearable. I brought you back to these mountains hoping someday to make things right, to gradually introduce you to Eleanor, to the truth about your heritage, but shame kept me silent year after year as Blackwell's son continued what his father started, purchasing surrounding properties, waiting for the opportunity to finish what should have been stopped decades ago when I first failed to speak the truth about what these developments would destroy. The manila envelopes arrived simultaneously at both cabins precisely at 9 o'clock Tuesday morning, delivered by a stone-faced sheriff's deputy who avoided meeting either Frank's or Ethan's eyes as he handed over the official-looking documents with a mumbled, "Sorry about this," before hurrying back to Bell, his patrol car. Inside, Ethan found densely printed legal papers declaring that Mountain Vista Development was initiating proceedings to reclaim land erroneously occupied by the Parker family, citing boundary discrepancies dating back to 1973 and mineral rights originally granted to the Blackwell Mining Corporation in 1952 that had never been formally surrendered despite the company's transition from mining to development. Frank studied the papers with growing despair, his hands trembling as he reached the final page where Richard Blackwell had included a personal note. As professional courtesy, you have 7 days to vacate voluntarily before formal proceedings commence. Before they had fully processed this shock, Blackwell's gleaming SUV appeared in their driveway, the developer emerging with the smooth confidence of a predator certain of its kill, carrying a leather portfolio and wearing an expression of regretful determination that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I take no pleasure in this, Frank," Blackwell announced as he entered without waiting for an invitation, placing his portfolio on their kitchen table and extracting what appeared to be yellowed survey documents. "But business is business, and these mountains are long overdue for progress." With calculated precision, Blackwell spread out the old papers, pointing to signatures at the bottom of each page. "Your own hand, Frank, on the original environmental impact statements from 1994. Certifying that no significant water sources existed in the development zone." Frank stared at his decades-old signature, the physical evidence of his past betrayal now weaponized against his family, while Blackwell continued with almost theatrical regret. "Similar notices have been delivered to Miss Winters, though I offered her a more generous accommodation given her advanced age. Neither of you have legal grounds to contest these proceedings, which my attorneys are prepared to drag out for years if necessary, draining whatever modest resources you might marshal for your defense." Despite his grandfather's warning to stay quiet, Ethan couldn't contain his anger. "You know about the underground spring, and that's what you're really after," he accused, satisfaction flaring briefly as surprise flickered across Blackwell's carefully composed features. "That's what this whole resort is really about, not skiing or hiking or mountain views." Blackwell recovered quickly, his smile tightening as he gathered his documents. "Clever boy, but ultimately irrelevant. The water rights belong to the mineral rights holders, which has been my family for over 70 years. I'm simply reclaiming what's legally ours." After Blackwell departed with a final reminder of their 7-day deadline, Ethan grabbed his binoculars and hiked to the ridge overlooking the North Valley, his suspicions confirmed by the sight of yellow excavators and drilling equipment already positioned on the adjacent property, surrounded by orange survey stakes matching those he'd seen earlier, with workers in hard hats consulting blueprints beside what appeared to be test drilling sites positioned in a pattern that seemed to radiate toward the direction of Eleanor's cabin and the hidden spring beneath it. A cold realization settled in Ethan's stomach as he observed through his binoculars a familiar truck parked near the workers, the same mud-splattered pickup with tinted windows that had slowly circled Eleanor's cabin days earlier, suggesting Blackwell's operation had been monitoring both properties while preparing this coordinated legal assault, leaving the family 1 week to somehow save not only their homes but the mountain's hidden heart itself. The attic of the Parker cabin had always been forbidden territory to Ethan, a dusty shrine to his parents' memory that his grandfather maintained with reverent, protective devotion. But desperate times called for desperate measures, and with only 6 days remaining before Blackwell's deadline, Ethan needed to find any legal documents that might help their case. The narrow pull-down ladder creaked ominously as he climbed into the musty darkness above, Max whining anxiously from below as dust motes danced in the thin shafts of afternoon light penetrating the single small window. Cardboard boxes labeled in his grandfather's precise handwriting lined the cramped space, each containing carefully preserved fragments of his parents' lives, his father's architectural drawings, his mother's teaching credentials, photo albums, wedding mementos, and finally what he sought, a box simply labeled "Legal Papers" tucked beneath the eaves. As Ethan sifted through birth certificates, insurance policies, and property records, his fingers brushed against something unexpected. A cream-colored envelope sealed with wax and addressed in his mother's elegant handwriting. For Ethan, to be opened when the mountain calls. The peculiar phrasing sent a shiver down his spine, as though his mother had somehow anticipated this very moment years before her death, and with trembling fingers, he carefully broke the wax seal. Unfolding 3 pages of handwritten stationery dated just 2 weeks before the accident that had claimed his parents' lives. "My dearest Ethan," his mother's words began, "if you're reading this, it means the time has come for you to learn the truth about our family and the sacred responsibility we have carried for generations." The letter continued in his mother's thoughtful voice, explaining how she had grown up learning the secrets of the mountain from her mother, Eleanor. How the underground spring represented not just water but a covenant with the land that stretched back through their maternal ancestry. "The rift between your grandmother and our family has been my greatest sorrow," she confessed. "My loyalty to your father and grandfather came at the terrible cost of betraying everything my mother taught me about our duty to protect the spring. But I've finally found the courage to begin healing this wound." His vision blurred with tears as he read his mother's declaration that she had initiated contact with Eleanor after years of silence, planning a family reconciliation trip to the mountains the very month they died. "I want you to know your grandmother, to learn from her as I did, to understand the legacy that will someday be yours to uphold," she wrote. "By the time you read this, I hope the wounds in our family will have long since healed. But if circumstances have prevented this, if something has kept us from telling you the full truth, then know that the spring beneath your grandmother's cabin is more precious than any development, any amount of money, any momentary human concern." The final paragraph contained specific instructions, coordinates to particular locations on the mountain, references to documents hidden in a hollow oak near the spring's surface opening, and a passionate plea. "Trust Eleanor, learn from her, and whatever has happened between the adults in your life, remember that you are the bridge between past and future, the next guardian of waters that sustain all life on this mountain." Clutching the letter to his chest, Ethan remained motionless in the dusty attic as grief and purpose collided within him. The tragedy of timing overwhelming in its cruelty, for had his parents lived just 1 more month, the family might have reunited, the spring's protection ensured, and Blackwell's threats rendered powerless against their combined knowledge and resolve. The Thompson family's barn had never held such a diverse gathering, its weathered walls now containing nearly 30 concerned citizens huddled on hay bales and folding chairs hastily arranged in a semicircle. Their breath visible in the chilly air despite the portable heaters Joe Thompson had positioned strategically around the space. Ethan stood nervously at the center, his mother's letter carefully transcribed into notes he clutched in sweating palms as he explained the true nature of Blackwell's development plans and the sacred spring threatened by the proposed resort. To his relief, the skepticism he feared was rapidly replaced by nodding heads and murmurs of recognition as neighbor after neighbor shared stories of Blackwell's pressure tactics, veiled threats, and divisive attempts to turn the community against itself. "He told us the Parkers had already agreed to sell," Lisa Wilson revealed, her husband nodding beside her. "Said we'd be foolish to hold out when everyone else was signing." Similar tactics had been used throughout Miller's Gap, creating an illusion of inevitable development that had successfully isolated those still resisting, until Ethan's gathering revealed the web of deception Blackwell had spun. Most surprising was the arrival of Harold Jenkins, the 87-year-old county historian whose family had documented the region's development since territorial days. Arriving mid-meeting with a leather satchel bulging with yellowed papers and maps, his gnarled finger jabbing emphatically at Ethan's crude drawing of the spring's location. "My grandfather recorded the 1,892 treaty negotiations right here," Jenkins announced, producing a brittle journal filled with meticulous handwriting. The Shoshone leaders specifically stipulated that the underground waters they called Earth's Blood were to remain undisturbed regardless of who held title to the surrounding lands. Jenkins had brought copies of the original treaty, subsequent mineral rights grants, and critically, a legal precedent from 1986, when similar indigenous water rights had been upheld by the state Supreme Court against corporate development. Blackwell's father tried burying these documents decades ago, Jenkins explained, his voice carrying surprising strength despite his advanced age. Paid good money to have certain pages removed from county records, but my family kept the originals, waiting for when they'd be needed again. A local environmental attorney volunteered to review the documents, while Sam Brightfeather, whose great-grandfather had been among the Shoshone signatories to the original treaty, offered to contact tribal authorities who would have additional standing to intervene. The meeting gained unexpected momentum when Sheriff Benson himself slipped in quietly near the end, listening from the shadows, before reluctantly admitting that county commissioners had approved Blackwell's permits during closed sessions, bypassing normal environmental review processes. "Not saying I can officially help," Benson muttered, careful of his position, "but seems to me citizens have a right to public hearings before something this big gets approved." By meeting's end, committees had formed to challenge the permits, document the spring's ecological importance, research legal strategies, and perhaps most importantly, break the isolation Blackwell had cultivated, with neighbors agreeing to stand together regardless of individual pressure. Their collective determination crystallized in Joe Thompson's closing declaration. "Some things matter more than money, and if we let them take our mountain's heart for a fancy resort, we might as well sell our own souls along with it." Eleanor's anguished cry reached Ethan before he had fully emerged from the forest path leading to her cabin, finding his grandmother standing beside a massive fallen oak that now blocked her only access road, its ancient trunk suspiciously clean-cut at the base despite the Blackwell construction workers' claims of natural failure due to yesterday's winds. The men departed with insincere apologies and promises to return with equipment to clear the road when scheduling permits, leaving Eleanor and Ethan to inspect the damage that effectively isolated her cabin from any vehicle access, a tactic too convenient to be coincidental, with only 4 days remaining before Blackwell's deadline. More disturbing was what Eleanor discovered during their inspection of the spring that afternoon, the previously crystal-clear water now showing an oily sheen in certain sections, while several of the blue crystals embedded in the surrounding rock had dulled to a sickly gray. "Contamination," Eleanor whispered, lifting a handful of water that no longer carried the same silky texture Ethan had observed on his first visit. "They've begun disrupting the underground channels." The realization that Blackwell might damage the spring beyond repair before their legal countermeasures could take effect filled Ethan with quiet panic. But it was Scout's behavior the following morning that revealed the true extent of Blackwell's deception. The golden retriever, normally content to remain near the cabin, began barking insistently toward the eastern ridge, an area outside the marked development zone that Blackwell had repeatedly claimed would remain untouched conservation land. Scout's agitation only increased as the day progressed, until finally the dog shot into the forest with such determination that Ethan and Max had no choice but to follow, struggling to keep pace as Scout led them through dense underbrush and over rocky terrain well beyond any trail, stopping occasionally to ensure they followed before pressing onward with single-minded purpose. After nearly 30 minutes of increasingly difficult terrain, Scout suddenly dropped to a stalking crouch, his golden fur almost glowing against the dark forest floor as he crept forward more cautiously. Ethan and Max following his lead until they reached the edge of a small clearing cleverly concealed from aerial view by camouflage netting stretched between trees. Beneath this covering, Ethan discovered the source of Scout's concern, a compact drilling rig mounted on treads for forest mobility, its bit positioned directly into exposed bedrock, with plastic pipes running from the equipment into large collection tanks bearing the discreet Mountain Vista Development logo, the entire operation clearly designed for stealth rather than legitimate testing. Remembering Mr. Jenkins' advice about gathering evidence, Ethan carefully photographed everything with his grandfather's old digital camera, documenting the coordinates using his mother's GPS instructions, meticulously capturing the drilling depth markers and collection system that proved Blackwell had already begun extracting water from the spring's network. So focused was Ethan on documenting the evidence that he failed to notice the approaching footsteps until a harsh voice shattered the forest quiet. "Hey, you can't be here." Turning with heart pounding, Ethan faced 2 security guards in Mountain Vista uniforms emerging from the trees, their expressions shifting from surprise to recognition to determination as they spotted the camera in Ethan's hands, one of them reaching for a radio, while the other advanced with outstretched hand. "That's company property you're photographing, kid," Hand over the camera now. Ethan's instincts took over before conscious thought could form, his body pivoting away from the advancing guards as he shouted, "Max, run!" Before plunging into the dense undergrowth, the precious camera clutched against his chest as branches whipped his face and thorns tore at his clothing. The guards' shouts echoed behind him, along with the crackling of their radios, summoning reinforcements. But Ethan had spent his childhood exploring these mountains while they were merely visitors with company maps, and he immediately veered toward a steep ravine local children called Devil's Backbone, where loose shale made pursuit treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with the hidden footholds. Max bounded ahead, a blur of gray fur weaving expertly between trees, occasionally circling back with ears alert as though guiding his human companion toward safer passages. The sound of ATVs starting up in the distance lent new urgency to Ethan's flight as he recognized Blackwell's men attempting to outflank him using the old logging roads. A realization that forced him to abandon the relatively open ridge trail for the nearly impassable thicket locals called Witch's Hair, a tangled maze of wild raspberry brambles and fallen timber that had claimed countless pairs of hiking pants over the years. Blood trickled from numerous scratches on his arms as Ethan crawled through a gap known only to children and wildlife, the brambles parting just enough to admit his slender frame while Max slipped through with practiced ease, both emerging on the far side muddy and breathless but temporarily concealed from pursuit. The respite proved brief as shouts indicated the guards had split up to surround the thicket, leaving Ethan no choice but to attempt the riskiest escape route, an ancient deer trail skirting Widow's Drop, a 40-foot cliff face typically avoided even by experienced hikers. Moving with desperate speed tempered by necessary caution, Ethan inched along the crumbling path, back pressed against the cliff face, each step carefully tested before committing his weight, the sounds of pursuit growing fainter as the guards wisely refused to follow. Nearly 2 hours after the initial encounter, Ethan stumbled into Eleanor's clearing, clothes torn and face scratched but triumphant, the camera intact with its precious evidence, to find his grandmother waiting with uncanny foreknowledge, hot tea already steeped and medical supplies arranged on her small table. After treating the worst of his cuts and examining the photographs, Eleanor's weathered face settled into lines of grim determination as she extinguished the lanterns and led Ethan to the cabin's root cellar, moving aside preserved foods to reveal a trapdoor concealed beneath an ordinary-looking braided rug. The Shoshone created passages beneath these mountains centuries before my family arrived, she explained, lifting the heavy door to expose rough-hewn stone steps descending into darkness. They connected the sacred spring to various ceremonial sites, creating a network that later served escaping slaves on the Underground Railroad, then prohibition runners during the 1,920 Eleanor described tunnels extending for miles beneath the mountain, some naturally formed and others painstakingly carved by hand, all carefully maintained by generations of guardians, including her own family, their existence kept secret from government surveys and property records. These passages legally established the spring's historical and cultural significance beyond any boundary dispute Blackwell can manufacture, she explained, passing Ethan an ancient leather-bound map detailing the underground network. More importantly, they provide access to critical points beneath the development areas where Blackwell's drilling threatens the water system, access we'll need in the coming days if we hope to document the damage and possibly prevent further contamination before the spring is irreparably harmed. The morning dawned clear and cold 3 days before Blackwell's deadline, frost crystallizing on Eleanor's cabin windows as Ethan nervously awaited his grandfather's arrival, having finally convinced Frank through a combination of pleading and hard truth that reconciliation offered their only hope against Blackwell's legal onslaught. When the distinctive rumble of Frank's old truck finally broke the mountain silence, Ethan watched his grandmother stiffen, her hands compulsively smoothing her simple dress before squaring her shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. Frank emerged from his vehicle slowly, looking older and more vulnerable than Ethan had ever seen him, hat clutched in weathered hands, his eyes fixed on Eleanor as she stood framed in the doorway of her cabin, neither elder speaking as decades of silence hung between them like an invisible wall. "Eleanor," Frank finally managed, his voice barely audible across the clearing. "You look well." The inadequacy of this greeting after 30 years of estrangement might have been comical under different circumstances, but Eleanor's response caught everyone by surprise, her stern composure crumbling as she crossed the distance between them with unexpected speed. One hand raised as though to strike Frank before it instead came to rest against his cheek, in a gesture of such intimate forgiveness that Ethan felt compelled to look away. "You foolish, stubborn man," Eleanor whispered, tears tracking freely down her lined face. "Daniel would have forgiven you decades ago." The mention of Eleanor's husband, Catherine's father, seemed to break something essential inside Frank, his shoulders slumping as he covered Eleanor's hand with his own. "I see him every time I look at that spring," Frank confessed, voice breaking. Standing there warning Harrison Blackwell that the test explosives were too close to the water channels, then the ground giving way beneath him while I just watched, too cowardly to back his claims, too ambitious to risk my position with the company. The full truth of their family tragedy unfolded in halting sentences between tears and long-held breaths. How Eleanor's husband had discovered Harrison Blackwell's initial attempts to access the spring 35 years earlier. How he'd confronted the developer with evidence of potential environmental damage. And how a demonstration blast had triggered a catastrophic collapse that claimed Daniel's life, while leaving no evidence of corporate wrongdoing. He died protecting what 7 generations of his family had safeguarded, Eleanor said, leading Frank to the small stone marker behind her cabin that Ethan had never noticed before. "While you chose Blackwell's money and promises over the truth, over our daughter's birthright." Frank knelt with difficulty before the marker, tracing the simple inscription with trembling fingers. "Catherine never knew the full truth," he admitted. "I told her it was a hiking accident, that her father had been careless on unstable ground. My shame grew with each passing year, until the gulf between us seemed too vast to ever cross." Eleanor placed her hand on Frank's shoulder, the gesture simultaneously offering forgiveness and acknowledging the weight of 3 decades lost to pride and guilt. "Daniel always said the mountain forgives those who return to it with honest hearts," she said softly. "We have wasted too many years fighting each other while the real enemy grew stronger, and now our grandson faces the consequences of our failure to stand united." As they returned to the cabin, something had fundamentally shifted between them. The bitter enmity replaced by the fragile beginnings of reconciliation founded on their shared love for Catherine's memory and Ethan's future. Their combined knowledge of the mountain and its secrets now representing the spring's best hope for survival against Blackwell's imminent threat. With newfound unity strengthening their resolve, Eleanor led Frank and Ethan to the underground chamber, housing the sacred spring, Frank's breath catching audibly as he entered the crystalline cavern for the first time in over 30 years, memories of his betrayal clearly written across his weathered features. Eleanor approached a seemingly ordinary section of the cavern wall and pressed her palm against a specific configuration of blue crystals, causing a previously invisible seam to appear in the ancient stone, revealing a small alcove where a cylindrical container crafted from polished cedar had been carefully preserved. "The original guardians created this," Eleanor explained, reverently removing what appeared to be an animal hide map from the container, its surface covered with intricate drawings in faded pigments of ochre, indigo, and a deep crimson that had somehow retained its vibrancy across centuries. As Eleanor carefully unrolled the hide across a flat stone beside the spring, Ethan recognized the mountain's distinctive silhouette rendered in profile, with the spring depicted at its center as a glowing blue spiral from which countless blue lines radiated outward like a living web, extending far beyond their property boundaries to connect with rivers, lakes, and smaller springs throughout the entire watershed, some reaching destinations over 50 miles distant. Frank studied the map with growing comprehension, his forester's knowledge of the region allowing him to identify key geographical features despite the map's ancient rendition. "This proves the underground channels feed water sources across 3 counties," he murmured, finger tracing one particularly prominent blue line that appeared to connect directly to Miller's Gap's town reservoir. "Mr. Jenkins arrived that afternoon at Eleanor's request, his roomy eyes widening with scholarly excitement as he donned white cotton gloves to examine the ancient document, his knowledge of indigenous languages allowing him to decipher the symbols and pictographs encircling the central spiral. "These markings establish a sacred covenant," Jenkins translated, pointing to recurring symbols around the spring's representation. "The spiral center is designated as the mountain's heart, not to be broken by men of any nation, while these boundary markers," his finger traced a series of distinctive symbols encircling a much larger area than their combined properties, "establish what the Shoshone considered protected territory under spiritual guardianship, essentially their version of legally designated conservation land." Most significant was Jenkins' translation of markings along the water channels, showing that the spring's waters had been ceremonially recognized as collective property belonging to all creatures, plants, and people within its reach, a designation that predated and potentially superseded later property divisions created by colonial authorities. This map doesn't just prove the ecological importance of the spring, Jenkins explained, carefully photographing each section with his specialized camera equipment. It establishes that Blackwell's development would impact federal lands, indigenous historical sites, and regional water sources far beyond the immediate property boundaries, triggering environmental review requirements his closed-door approvals deliberately circumvented. While the ceremonial designations may qualify for protection under the Historical Preservation Act that specifically shields indigenous sacred sites from commercial development, regardless of current property ownership, the Millers Gap County Courthouse had never seen such a crowd. Its oak-paneled meeting room filled beyond capacity with concerned citizens spilling into the hallway, many wearing hastily made Save Our Mountain buttons created by the Wilson children the previous evening. Ethan's heart pounded painfully against his ribs as he approached the podium. The 5 commissioners seated behind their imposing bench, watching with expressions ranging from polite boredom to barely concealed impatience. Commissioner Hamilton repeatedly checking his gold watch, a gift from Blackwell Development according to Sheriff Benson's discreet research. Despite his trembling hands, Ethan's voice grew stronger as he methodically presented their findings, from photographs of the unauthorized drilling equipment to the ancient maps evidence of far-reaching water connections, while Mr. Jenkins followed with expert testimony about the spring's historical significance and documentation of indigenous protection treaties, the audience responding with supportive murmurs that the chairman struggled to silence with his gavel. Frank and Eleanor sat together in the front row, their reconciled presence sending its own powerful message to a community that remembered their bitter estrangement, while Joe Thompson distributed copies of geological surveys contradicting Blackwell's environmental impact statements, highlighting discrepancies that suggested deliberate falsification of data regarding the mountain's underground hydrology. When Ethan described the spring's contamination, presenting water samples showing disturbing chemical changes since Blackwell's drilling began, Richard Blackwell finally abandoned his practiced pleasant expression, rising with theatrical exasperation to approach the commissioner's bench. With all due respect to young Master Parker's imaginative presentation, Blackwell began, his condescending tone drawing angry mutters from the audience. These are merely the fanciful stories of a child combined with outdated indigenous legends and amateur environmental assessments, none of which invalidate Mountain Vista's legally established rights to develop property we've rightfully acquired. The developer produced a thick binder of documents with impressive gold seals and official signatures, including the original papers bearing Frank's signature from 30 years earlier. Our legal team has thoroughly vetted every aspect of this development, Blackwell continued smoothly, while our environmental consultants have certified minimal impact on surrounding areas. These children's drawings, he gestured dismissively toward the ancient map, and these amateur photographs prove nothing beyond a family's sentimental attachment to land they no longer legally control. Chairman Peterson, whose campaign had reportedly received substantial contributions from development interests, nodded along with Blackwell's presentation before responding with clearly rehearsed concern. While we appreciate the community's interest in this matter, the Commission is bound by legal property rights and existing agreements, which appear to support Mountain Vista's position. The audience erupted in protests as Commissioner Taylor, the only woman on the panel, attempted to propose an independent environmental assessment before final approval, her motion dying without a second as her male colleagues studied their papers with sudden fascination. This meeting has been informative, Peterson concluded blandly, but without compelling legal evidence contradicting Mountain Vista's established rights, we must allow the properly permitted development to proceed according to schedule. We'll take these concerns under advisement and revisit the matter at next month's regular session. The dismissive finality of the gavel's bang echoed through the stunned audience. Blackwell's triumphant smile barely concealed as he gathered his materials, pausing beside Ethan to whisper, "Admirable effort, boy, truly touching, but the adult world runs on contracts and money, not children's crusades or fairy tales about sacred waters." Leaving Ethan standing before the empty commissioner's bench with the devastating realization that official channels had failed them. The bulldozers scheduled to break ground in just 36 hours according to the construction timeline Blackwell had confidently shared with the commissioners. The county hearing's failure left only desperate measures, Ethan concluded as darkness fell over Miller's Gap that evening. the construction equipment already assembled at the development site visible as ominous silhouettes against the moonlit ridge. "Sometimes you have to make your own justice when the system fails," Frank had whispered before retiring to bed, the words less advice than reluctant acknowledgement of their dwindling options, which Ethan interpreted as tacit permission for the plan forming in his mind. Scout's injured paw had healed completely, the golden retriever moving with silent grace alongside Max as the unlikely trio made their way through pre-dawn shadows toward Blackwell's local office, a converted Victorian at the edge of town where light security reflected the developer's confidence in his official protection. Ethan had spent enough time at Sheriff Benson's home with his son Matt to know the deputy rotation schedules, timing their approach during the 20-minute gap between night patrols, Scout leading them unerringly to the building's rear entrance where a partially open basement window, presumably for ventilation, offered barely enough space for Ethan's slender frame to squeeze through after boosting both dogs through the opening. The office interior smelled of expensive cologne and furniture polish, the gleaming mahogany and leather speaking of wealth extracted from communities like theirs for generations, while framed photographs displayed Richard Blackwell alongside governors and senators, the political connections that made his development seemingly unstoppable. Ethan moved with practiced silence from his years of hunting with his grandfather, using the small penlight to navigate toward Blackwell's private office, where the most sensitive documents would likely be secured. The door yielded to Scout's surprising talents, the retriever rising on hind legs to depress the lever-style handle, leading Ethan to wonder about the dog's previous training and experiences before meeting Eleanor. Inside, Blackwell's massive desk dominated the room, its polished surface reflecting moonlight from the large windows overlooking the town square. The wall of filing cabinets behind it organized with military precision, each drawer neatly labeled in categories that made Ethan's search remarkably efficient. The Miller's Gap, Eagle's Nest Resort drawer contained exactly what they needed. The original environmental surveys showing clearly marked underground water channels extending far beyond their properties, with handwritten notes indicating where data should be adjusted before submission to county officials, alongside a second file labeled Community Relations containing detailed records of payments to Commissioner Peterson and 3 other board members, thinly disguised as consulting fees but clearly documenting systematic bribery to secure development approvals without proper review. Working quickly, Ethan photographed each incriminating page with his grandfather's digital camera, careful to include letterheads and signatures, his heart pounding so loudly he feared it might alert the night watchman supposedly monitoring the building's front entrance. The most damning evidence emerged from a leather portfolio hidden in Blackwell's personal safe, its combination remarkably, arrogantly set to the developer's birth year, containing geological assessments of the spring water's unique mineral composition alongside marketing materials for Blackwell's ancient mountain elixir, complete with bottling facility blueprints and profit projections in the hundreds of millions, confirming their suspicions about Blackwell's true interest in their mountain. As Ethan finished photographing the final documents, carefully returning each to its original position, the distant sound of a car engine broke the night's silence, headlights sweeping across the office windows as a vehicle turned into the private parking area, followed by the unmistakable voice of Richard Blackwell himself, apparently returning to retrieve something forgotten. The office door key already rattling in the lock as Ethan and the dogs froze in momentary panic. The heavy office door swung open as Ethan desperately signaled the dogs to hide, Scout instantly understanding as he slipped behind a leather sofa, dragging a reluctant Max by the collar, while Ethan himself barely managed to duck beneath the massive desk, heart threatening to burst from his chest, as Blackwell's Italian leather shoes appeared mere inches from his hiding place. "I know you're in here, boy," Blackwell's voice came with chilling certainty, the sudden flare of overhead lights eliminating any hope of remaining undetected. "My security system alerts my phone whenever someone enters the building." Rising slowly, camera clutched against his chest, Ethan faced the developer across the polished expanse of desk, Blackwell's expression shifting from triumph to cold fury as he spotted the camera and opened safe behind Ethan. Breaking and entering, theft of confidential documents, corporate espionage, Blackwell enumerated with dangerous calm while pressing a button on his desk phone. "Security, please detain a trespasser in my office, and contact the county prosecutor's emergency line." With the building's exits now guarded, Blackwell circled the desk like a predator, his practiced charm evaporated to reveal something reptilian beneath. "I've underestimated your family's persistence for 2 generations now," he admitted, gesturing for Ethan to sit while maintaining a cautious distance. Your grandfather's conscience proved unexpectedly resilient 30 years ago. Your mother's environmental activism threatened our permits before her convenient accident, and now here you are. Continuing their futile crusade, the casual reference to his parents' deaths as convenient sent ice through Ethan's veins, though Blackwell quickly clarified with a dismissive wave. No, we didn't arrange their car accident, though I won't pretend we mourned the elimination of a significant obstacle. Blackwell's eyes gleamed with an almost religious fervor as he continued. What none of you comprehend is the true value hidden beneath that worthless mountain land. The spring water contains a unique microbiological profile found nowhere else on Earth. With remarkable properties, our pharmaceutical division has been quietly researching for decades. Removing a small vial of clear liquid from his desk drawer, Blackwell held it reverently to the light. Properly processed and marketed, this water represents billions, not merely for luxury resorts but for medical applications, cosmetics, life extension therapies. Your grandmother's stubborn guardianship has delayed access to this resource for 3 generations, a primitive superstition impeding human progress. Scientific advancement. Ethan's stunned silence seemed to encourage Blackwell's unprecedented candor. Yes, I've always known Eleanor Winters is your grandmother. My father kept meticulous records of your family connections, your mother's estrangement, all leveraged for maximum advantage. Divide and conquer, the strategy that built empires. The distant wail of approaching sirens shifted Blackwell's expression to annoyed impatience. Your juvenile heroics changed nothing. Even with these documents, your family lacks the resources to challenge our legal team. By this time tomorrow, our equipment begins drilling directly into the spring's primary chamber. The office door burst open with sudden violence, revealing Frank Parker with Sheriff Benson beside him. Both men breathing heavily as though having run up the stairs. Tracked your phone, Frank explained briefly to his astonished grandson, before turning to Blackwell with quiet fury. Sheriff has some interesting questions about those payments to county officials documented in your financial records, Richard. Apparently, Commissioner Taylor received similar offers but kept the evidence, which she's sharing with state investigators as we speak. Dawn broke over Miller's Gap with unprecedented activity as news vans from 3 counties crowded the courthouse square, reporters clutching coffee cups interviewing townspeople, while satellite trucks established uplinks to regional networks. The previous night's confrontation at Blackwell's office having transformed their private struggle into explosive headlines. Sheriff Benson's midnight press statement regarding ongoing investigations into alleged corruption involving county officials and Mountain Vista Development had triggered a journalistic feeding frenzy, with Commissioner Taylor's courageous decision to publicly share records of Blackwell's attempted bribes adding fuel to the growing scandal. By mid-morning, environmental reporters from national outlets had descended upon the small mountain community, their initial interest in corruption allegations quickly expanding to include the sacred spring itself after Mr. Jenkins conducted an impromptu historical tour of the relevant sites, his scholarly passion for indigenous history proving surprisingly telegenic as cameras captured his emotional descriptions of the ancient protection treaties. Eleanor emerged from decades of reclusive existence to grant a single powerful interview beside the surface manifestation of the spring, her weathered face and quiet dignity conveying moral authority that resonated far beyond their mountain community as she explained her family's 7-generation stewardship. This isn't merely about property rights, but about a sacred trust that transcends ownership, she told viewers across the region, the afternoon sunlight illuminating her silver hair like a halo, while Scout rested his head protectively against her knee. Blackwell's attempts to dismiss the unfolding narrative as rural sentimentality obstructing progress backfired spectacularly when a former Mountain Vista employee delivered internal company emails to investigative reporters, documenting systematic falsification of environmental impact studies across 7 different development projects, and revealing plans to market the spring water for luxury wellness products without required FDA testing or approval. The community's response proved equally powerful, with hundreds gathering for an impromptu vigil on the mountain access road leading to the development site, their vehicles effectively blocking construction equipment while maintaining technical legality as a religious gathering protected by First Amendment rights. The participants, including families who had already sold their land but now experienced profound seller's remorse after learning Blackwell's true intentions. Pressure mounted on remaining loyal commissioners as their office phones rang constantly with constituent concerns. news cameras documenting their arrivals and departures from public buildings, while state environmental officials announced emergency reviews of previously approved permits based on evidence of fraudulent submissions and approval processes. The story's rapid expansion beyond local boundaries came largely through social media, where Ethan's eloquent explanation of the spring's ecological importance gained millions of views. His teenage sincerity cutting through political noise as he displayed photographs documenting the water's contamination alongside images of the ancient map showing its connections throughout the regional watershed. Frank's emotional public apology for his role in the original cover-up 3 decades earlier, standing shoulder to shoulder with Eleanor in reconciled purpose, provided the human redemption narrative that transformed complicated environmental disputes into compelling human drama. While tribal representatives arriving from the Shoshone Nation to assert historical claims added constitutional weight through indigenous rights protections recently strengthened by Supreme Court decisions. By sunset, Governor Harrison had issued a statement announcing a 30-day emergency stay on all Mountain Vista development activities pending comprehensive investigation, effectively halting construction while regulatory authorities examined Ethan's photographic evidence and the environmental implications of disrupting the spring's underground channels. The tremendous public pressure having accomplished in 24 hours what legal challenges might have required years to achieve. The federal courthouse in Riverton presented an imposing contrast to Miller's Gap's modest county building, its marble columns and vaulted ceilings designed to inspire appropriate reverence for the legal proceedings unfolding within, where Judge Marion Holbrook, renowned for her environmental jurisprudence, presided over the emergency hearing with stern efficiency. Mr. Jenkins had worked through 2 sleepless nights preparing their case, his lifetime of historical research culminating in this moment as he shuffled to the witness stand, his 87 years temporarily falling away as he articulated the spring's historical significance with scholarly precision, presenting authenticated documents, establishing the site's continuous ceremonial use for over 8 centuries, alongside photographs of ancient pictographs whose authenticity had been verified by 3 independent anthropologists. Eleanor followed with quietly powerful testimony about her family's multi-generational stewardship, while Frank's emotional account of Blackwell's original cover-up 3 decades earlier, presented with unflinching accountability for his own complicity, established a pattern of corporate deception that visibly affected the normally impassive judge. When Ethan's turn came, his evidence proved unexpectedly compelling, the judge leaning forward with growing interest as he methodically presented his photographs of unauthorized drilling equipment, contaminated water samples, and most devastatingly, Blackwell's internal documents revealing plans to extract and commodify the spring water without required environmental assessments or proper permitting. Throughout these presentations, Blackwell's high-powered legal team grew visibly uncomfortable, their objections becoming increasingly desperate as tribal representatives presented constitutional arguments regarding protected indigenous sacred sites, their standing significantly strengthened by President Harris's recent executive order, expanding historical preservation protections for sites with documented ceremonial significance, predating colonial settlement. The crowded courtroom fell silent when environmental scientists from State University confirmed that disrupting the spring's underground channels would likely impact water quality for 17 downstream communities, while geological experts testified that Blackwell's planned excavation methods would irreparably damage the aquifer's natural filtration system developed over millennia. Judge Holbrook's ruling came with unexpected swiftness after brief deliberation, her normally measured judicial temperament giving way to undisguised indignation as she enumerated the legal thresholds Mountain Vista had violated. This court finds compelling evidence that Mountain Vista Development knowingly falsified environmental impact statements, deliberately circumvented indigenous consultation requirements, attempted to influence public officials through improper financial incentives, and willfully concealed information regarding potential watershed contamination affecting multiple communities. The emergency injunction she issued exceeded even Mr. Jenkins' carefully calibrated requests, immediately halting all development activities within a 5-mile radius of the spring, prohibiting any water extraction from the underground network, and ordering comprehensive archaeological and environmental assessments to be conducted by independent experts with indigenous representation. More significantly, Judge Holbrook referred Blackwell's documented legal violations to the U.S. Attorney's Office for potential criminal prosecution. noting that corporate document falsification affecting public water sources potentially constituted reckless endangerment of community health and safety. The historic implications of the ruling became immediately apparent. As tribal representatives embraced Eleanor outside the courthouse, ceremonially acknowledging her family's centuries of spring guardianship, while environmental journalists broadcast live updates to increasingly engaged national audiences. Frank and Eleanor stood side by side on the courthouse steps, their reconciliation now a powerful symbol of restoration and healing that transcended their personal history. While Ethan found himself unexpectedly addressing questions from environmental law students who had traveled overnight to witness the precedent-setting case. County Commissioner Peterson announced his resignation that same evening, as state investigators expanded their corruption probe to include 3 previous development projects. While Mountain Vista's stock price tumbled 17% in a single trading session, shareholders demanding explanations for Blackwell's reckless legal exposure of the company. Most meaningful to Ethan was the small ceremony conducted at sunset, when Shoshone elders invited the Parker family to the spring's surface opening, where ancient protection prayers were recited for the first time in over a century, formally recognizing Eleanor, Frank and Ethan as the current generation of guardians in an unbroken lineage stretching back through time immemorial. The golden light of autumn painted Miller's Gap in warm amber hues, as Ethan led another group of visitors along the newly established Heritage Trail, their faces rapt with attention as he explained the underground spring's complex hydrology and cultural significance. His confidence having blossomed in the 6 months since Judge Holbrook's final ruling had permanently designated the spring and surrounding 5,000 acres as the Shining Waters Historical Preserve. Summer had 5,000 in the spring, witnessed remarkable transformations. Eleanor selling her isolated cabin to move into Frank's home, where Catherine's childhood bedroom had been lovingly prepared for her. The decades of estrangement dissolved in their shared purpose as official stewards of the protected lands, their complementary knowledge of the mountain's secrets now preserved rather than divided. The spring itself had begun healing once the drilling equipment was removed and contaminated sections meticulously restored under Eleanor's guidance, the water's legendary clarity returning gradually, like a patient recovering from long illness. Indigenous ceremonies conducted monthly at the sacred sites, now properly recognized in historical registries with permanent protections that would outlast any future development pressures. Blackwell himself had avoided imprisonment through costly legal maneuvering but faced financial ruin as shareholders abandoned Mountain Vista following damaging congressional testimony about systematic environmental violations across multiple projects, his empire collapsing as swiftly as it had been built. While the lands previously purchased for development had been acquired through a conservation trust funded by a coalition of environmental organizations and returned to public access with sustainable usage guidelines. Scout and Max had become inseparable companions, often leading visitors along the trail with dignified purpose as though understanding their role in the unfolding story. Scout's injured paw now showing no trace of the wound that had originally brought Ethan to Eleanor's cabin during that fateful snowstorm that seemed both yesterday and a lifetime ago. Most profound was Ethan's personal transformation from uncertain boy to purposeful young man. His summer spent dividing time between studying environmental science with university researchers documenting the preserve's unique ecosystem and learning traditional ecological knowledge from tribal elders who had embraced him as a worthy guardian of their ancestral waters. The journal his mother had kept now continued in his own careful handwriting as he recorded seasonal changes, wildlife movements, and the spring's ongoing recovery. The Parker home itself had been transformed by Eleanor's presence, fragrant herbs hanging from kitchen rafters, her weathered hands teaching Ethan traditional crafts in evening hours while Frank carved elaborate walking sticks for the guided tours that had become an unexpected source of sustainable income for the family and community. On this particular golden afternoon, as sunlight filtered through autumn foliage while Ethan pointed out rare blue lupine blooming near the spring's surface opening, his narrative incorporating both scientific facts and Shoshone water wisdom with equal reverence, he caught sight of Eleanor and Frank watching proudly from the trail's edge. Their reconciled presence embodying the preserve's official motto now carved on the entrance sign, "Healing waters, healing hearts, healing land." Ethan understood with bone-deep certainty that he stood exactly where he belonged, inheritor not merely of property but of purpose. 7th-generation guardian now training the 8th, the ancient spring continuing its patient, essential work beneath the mountains that had witnessed human dramas come and go while its waters flowed ceaselessly. carrying wisdom from past to future.